She saved an abandoned cat. Years later, he saved her life. Sarah walked hurriedly through the dark streets of the city. The cold wind bit his face, and the light rain made the asphalt slippery. It was an ordinary night after a long day of work, and all she wanted was to get home, take off her wet shoes, and plop down on the couch. But in the midst of the silence, interrupted only by the sound of water drops, a weak and insistent sound caught his attention. She paused for a moment, frowning. The meow came from under a car parked on the edge of the sidewalk. He looked around, but the street was deserted. At this point in the night, no one seemed to care about such a low sound, almost unnoticed among the noises of the city. But for Sarah, that sound awakened something. He bent down, trying to see better under the vehicle. In the dark, a small figure huddled against the wet floor. A cat, thin, dirty, and shaking. His fur was matted, and his eyes were half closed, as if the simple force of keeping them open was exhausting. Sarah hesitated. It wasn't the first time I'd seen an animal abandoned on the streets. I knew that taking him home would mean an added responsibility. He already had a cat and a job that took up almost all of his time. Logic said to move on. Pretend you didn't hear anything. But something inside her stopped her. She approached slowly, expecting the cat to run, but it didn't move. He just remained there, without reacting, as if he had already accepted his fate. This detail squeezed Sarah's heart. He took him in his arms carefully, feeling the animal's body almost weightless, cold to the touch, as if the rain had stolen all the heat he still had left. The small, trembling body against her chest made her realize that this wasn't just another stray cat. He was a living being on the verge of collapse, and at that moment he depended on her. Without thinking further, she held him lightly against her and hurriedly walked towards her apartment. Sometimes the most unexpected moments completely change the course of our lives. A simple deviation from the routine, a closer look at something that everyone ignores. Small decisions can have unimaginable consequences. Sarah didn't know it yet, but that choice would change everything. And you? Have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever found an abandoned animal and had to decide whether to move on or help it? Tell us in the comments. I want to know your story. Sarah arrived home with the little cat in her arms, feeling its fragile body against her chest. As soon as he entered, he closed the door and walked straight into the living room, where he placed the animal on a soft towel. The bright light further revealed his condition. The fur, which should have been fluffy and shiny, was dirty, clinging to the thin body. The bones were visible beneath the thin skin, and the eyes, which should have expressed some sign of curiosity or fear, seemed dull, as if they were already accustomed to suffering. She fetched a bowl of warm milk and some wet food, hoping he would react to the smell of the food. But nothing happened. The little cat didn't even move its head. He just remained lying down, breathing slowly and irregularly. With each passing minute, Sarah felt a greater weight on her chest. Maybe he had arrived too late. Maybe that animal no longer had the strength to react. He took a plastic syringe, filled it with some liquid, and carefully tried to put a few drops into the cat's mouth. The first attempt was frustrating. He didn't respond. But by gently insisting, he managed to get him to swallow small amounts. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That night, Sarah barely slept. Every hour he got up to check if he was still breathing. The animal's body felt too hot, and its breathing was heavy. Something was wrong. The next morning, without wasting any time, he took him to a veterinarian. Once the specialist examined the little cat, he confirmed what Sarah already feared. He was severely malnourished and had an advanced infection. The prognosis was not good. The weakened body had little chance of reacting to the treatment, and recovery would depend on a lot of intensive care. Medications were prescribed, and Sarah received detailed instructions on how to feed him and keep him warm. She returned home determined to do everything she could. During the following days, His routine revolved completely around that little being. Every few hours, I administered liquid food with the syringe, ensuring that, even if he wasn't hungry, he received the necessary nutrients. He gave medications, at the exact times, and kept the environment warm, protecting him from the cold that could worsen his condition. The days passed, and despite all the effort, there were no signs of improvement. The cat slept the whole time, barely moving, and Sarah wondered if he could even notice what was happening around him. But then one morning, something changed. Sarah woke up and, as usual, went to the corner of the room where she had made a comfortable space for the animal. But when he got there, he didn't find him lying down like he had on previous days. His heart raced for a moment, until he noticed a small shadow next to the bed. The cat was standing, staggering, still weak, but standing. He had stood up on his own for the first time. It was a sign, a small but powerful sign, that he wanted to live. Sarah watched the little cat explore the environment with slow, insecure steps. He was still fragile, but something about him had changed. The way she tried to balance herself, the silent determination in every movement. There was a strength there, hidden beneath all the vulnerability. That's why she decided to name him Thor. The name seemed ironic at first, considering he could barely walk without tripping, but Sarah knew that true strength wasn't in size or appearance, but in the will to keep going. And Thor wanted to continue. As the weeks passed, his recovery became more and more evident. He began to feed himself, gaining weight and energy. The fur, once dull and shaggy, transformed into a soft, shiny coat. Little by little, the image of the weak and defenseless cat that Sarah found that rainy night disappeared, giving way to an agile and lively animal. But what surprised Sarah most was not Thor's physical transformation, but something much more subtle: the connection he seemed to develop with her. Unlike other cats who were independent and detached, Thor was always attentive to his owner's every move. On the days when Sarah came home from work more tired than usual, he would wait for her at the door and follow her around the house, lying down next to her on the sofa, as if he understood that it was a difficult day. When she was sad, he would approach her silently, without asking for affection or attention. He just stayed there, present. And when Sarah fell ill for the first time since Thor arrived, she noticed something even more curious. Instead of following his normal routine, the cat spent the entire day by her side, lying on her bed, paying attention to every movement. Even when he had the chance to go out and play, he preferred to remain there, watching her as if he understood that something was not right. These little moments began to repeat themselves frequently. He wasn't just an ordinary house cat. He observed, noticed, and reacted accordingly to what was happening to Sarah. It was as if he somehow knew when she needed him, even without her saying anything. Thor wasn't just an animal that Sarah had rescued. He became something much bigger than that. As time passed, Sarah and Thor developed a routine that became almost automatic. Every morning when she woke up, she found the cat already lying near her feet, watching her with attentive eyes, as if he was waiting for her to get up. While she prepared the coffee, Thor followed her silently, keeping a small distance, but never losing sight of her movements. During the day, while Sarah worked in the makeshift office inside the house, he curled up in a nearby corner, curled in on himself but always alert. If she got up to get something from the kitchen, he followed. If she changed rooms, he accompanied her. It wasn't invasive, just present. At night, when Sarah returned from work later than usual, there was Thor, waiting at the door, with the patience of someone who knew exactly when she would arrive. And on the days when the routine seemed more tiring, when she didn't even have the strength to prepare dinner and just threw herself on the couch, Thor would approach without making a sound, jump next to her, and snuggle close to her, purring softly, as if he knew that it would help her relax. Sarah started to notice little patterns. When everything was fine, Thor behaved normally, playing around the house, exploring corners, watching through the window. But when something wasn't right, his attitude changed completely. He became more attentive, closer, as if he was trying to warn her of something that not even she herself noticed. There was one night in particular that made this connection even clearer. Sarah had been feeling strange all day, a slight headache that intensified throughout the afternoon. He thought it was just tiredness and ignored the signs, but as soon as he got home, he noticed that his body was heavy, and his breathing was a little more difficult. As soon as he lay down on the bed, Thor jumped next to him and remained there, motionless. She tried to push him away so she could adjust herself better, but he refused to leave. He lay down very close to her chest, pressing his body against hers, his eyes fixed, as if he were analyzing every breath, every involuntary movement. That night, Sarah slept poorly, sometimes waking up, feeling chills and dizzy. But Thor remained there, without moving. The next morning, when he woke up, he felt a little better and realized that Thor was still there, in exactly the same position. It was as if he knew he needed to stay. Sarah had never seen anything like it. This was not common cat behavior. It was not simply a reflection of companionship or attachment. It was something deeper, a connection she still couldn't explain. And although she didn't know it at the time, that connection would still save her life. The years passed, and Sarah's life became busier. Work demanded more and more time and energy, and moments of rest seemed to become rarer. Fatigue accumulated, but she tried to ignore the signs, getting used to exhaustion as if it were an inevitable part of her routine. Thor was still always around, observant as ever, but Sarah no longer paid as much attention to him as before. In recent months, there were days when she barely noticed his presence. So focused was she on deadlines, meetings, and responsibilities. He still waited for her at the door every night, but now, often, she just hurried past him, not noticing the watchful eyes that followed her around the house. It was on a seemingly ordinary night that everything changed. Sarah arrived home feeling more tired than usual. Her head was heavy, her body was slower than usual. He thought it was just a reflection of another long day. He quickly bent down to pet Thor, but soon got up and went straight to the kitchen. I wanted to prepare something quick to eat before bed. As he was cutting some vegetables, a strange discomfort began to take over his body. First, it was a slight dizziness, something that made his vision momentarily blur. She blinked a few times, trying to shake off the sensation, and placed one hand on the counter. Maybe it was just hunger. But before he could finish the thought, the world around him seemed to spin. His body became weak, his legs gave way, and in an instant, everything went black. Sarah passed out right there, falling to the kitchen floor. Thor, who was sitting at the entrance to the room, immediately realized that something was wrong. He approached, sniffed Sarah's face, and tried to nudge her with his head, but she didn't react. Her breathing was uneven, her body still. This was all recorded by the house's security camera after the entire event. It was then that something instinctive awakened within him. As if he knew he needed to act quickly, Thor ran to the door of the house and began to meow loudly, a high-pitched and insistent sound. Then he started scratching the door, first lightly then harder, trying to attract the attention of someone outside. The repetitive sound ended up arousing the curiosity of the neighbor, who lived in the apartment next door. He already knew Thor and knew that the cat never made that kind of noise. That wasn't normal. He approached Sarah's door and called her name, waiting for her to respond. The silence made him uneasy. It was then that he looked out the window and saw something that made his heart race. Sarah was lying on the kitchen floor, motionless. Without hesitation, the neighbor picked up the phone and called paramedics. Within minutes, the ambulance arrived, and the rescuers broke down the door to enter. They found Sarah unconscious, with clear signs of a serious episode of low blood pressure. If they had taken longer, the consequences could have been much worse. As the paramedics worked to stabilize her, Thor remained nearby, watching everything carefully, never leaving her side. For him, Nothing else mattered at that moment. When Sarah regained consciousness, she was already in the ambulance. It took him a few seconds to understand what had happened, but as soon as he heard someone mention that it was his cat who alerted the neighbor, a single question came to his mind. Was Thor okay? The response was immediate. Yes, he was fine. And in a way, he had just returned the favor Sarah had done him years ago. She saved him when he needed it most. Now it was his turn to save her. Sarah woke up feeling the light bothering her eyes. The environment around him was cold, with the distant sound of heart monitors and nurses' hurried footsteps echoing through the hallways. It took him a few seconds to get his bearings, to understand that he was in a hospital. The last thing he remembered was the dizzy feeling in the kitchen, the floor quickly approaching, and then emptiness. His body was still weak, but his mind was already beginning to recover its scattered thoughts. It was then that a single question appeared, as if it were more urgent than anything else, and before he could even try to formulate words, he heard the familiar voice of his neighbor next to his bed, telling him everything that had happened. The story seemed surreal. Thor, her silent and observant cat, noticed something was wrong before anyone else did. He didn't accept the silence. He didn't sit still waiting for something to happen. He acted. He got his neighbor's attention in the only way he knew how, insisting until someone listened. Sarah had never underestimated the intelligence of animals, but this was different. Thor didn't just react to what was happening. He understood the seriousness of the situation. He knew she needed help. As he took it all in, a memory came to mind. The rainy night years ago, when he found a small cat cowering under a car, without the strength to fight for its life. She took him in her arms, felt his cold and fragile body, and knew she had to save him. At that time, she didn't imagine that same cat, who she rescued without hesitation, would one day do the same for her. It was then that he realized something even bigger, the impact that small gestures can have. When she decided to stop that night and save a defenseless animal, she had no idea that she was changing not only his fate, but her own as well. Animals perceive more than we realize. They see beyond the obvious, feel our emotions, and often understand what is happening around us even before we do. Thor wasn't just a cat. He was a companion, a protector, a living being who in some way recognized and returned the love he received. And in that moment, Sarah understood that by saving Thor years ago, she was unknowingly saving herself. Sarah returned home the next day, still a little weak, but with her mind more awake than ever. As soon as she opened the door, she found Thor sitting in the same place as always, waiting for her. But this time, there was something different in his gaze. He didn't run off to play or make any impatient gestures. He just watched her silently, as if making sure everything was okay. She slowly approached and sat down next to him, feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the last few days. She never imagined that that little puppy she rescued years ago would be responsible for keeping her alive in one of the most critical moments of her life. The circle had closed. What she did for him that rainy night had come back to her in ways she never could have predicted. Thor wasn't just a cat. He was a living reminder that true connections cross barriers, that love and gratitude don't need words to be expressed, that sometimes by saving someone, you may be, without realizing it, saving yourself. Animals understand what we don't say. They feel what we try to hide. They are present when we need them most, even when we don't ask for help. And this story is just further proof that the bond between humans and animals can go much further than we imagine. If you believe that animals are capable of feeling and perceiving things that we cannot, subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories. And click on the next video where I tell another exciting story about an animal that did something unbelievable.